Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Hoover. I'm one of the worship leaders at Sycamore Hill Church, and tonight we have a special panel featuring Pastor John Boulay, head pastor of Sycamore Hill Church, and Pastor Dwayne Davis, who is the pastor at the Wilmington campus. And this conversation pretty much came about after it became clear that we needed to respond to some of the growing racial tensions that has been happening in our country. And as we prayed and processed what the best response could be, it was decided that a honest and genuine conversation would serve the church the most at this time. So tonight we're just going to have a dialogue about race, the church, justice, and it won't scratch everyone's back itch. I like to think of it as dim sum, which is one of my favorite foods to eat. Dim sum is a Chinese traditional meal that consists of many small plates. I don't know if you guys have had dim sum before, but the whole point is you enjoy each portion of the small plate as a whole of a meal. So you're not getting the full entree of every dish, you're just kind of getting a little taste. So that's what tonight is going to feel like, is getting a little taste of each of the topics that we might bring up. So with that said, we're going to get started. So we're talking about race and racism in the church. As pastors, I find it more common that pastors address issues like sexuality or relationship, and it feels really hard to talk about racism. Can you share why that might be?
Yeah, I'll give I think probably, and obviously Pastor Dwayne and I are kind of coming at it from, where we originate, but in my mind, just as I kind of try to think back, issues of race, I've sometimes thought, well, we already know this. Like, obviously we know that we're all equal. And so it's not regularly surfacing. In other words, it's not, there's not a voice in my head or, we'll probably talk a lot about lenses that we look at life with. As I'm going through the Word, probably other things are surfacing as the main point or the second point or the third point. And I think probably that's because, majority white culture is not thinking in terms of race. They're operating in terms of race, but they're not thinking in terms of race. And so what's operative versus what's thoughtful or cognitive are two different things. I think that probably plays a role.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd add to that.
Sure. I think that's, like you said, we've had some different experiences, and I've pastored in Philadelphia, and so it hasn't really been a troublesome thing in the past to speak about race, especially when it is tied in with the scripture. I don't generally, as a rule, just grab topics kind of away from the scripture during a time of preaching and teaching. Mm-hmm. So, but if those topics are surfacing in the scripture, or if the scripture and the topic are lining up, then I speak to it. And in certain contexts, I think maybe it comes, it may come up more and more readily, but yeah. So
yeah. So generally, it can feel like a tricky topic to unpack, whether or not it's something that you find easily in scripture, or if it's your cultural lens, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I feel like we're living in a really unique civil moment right now. We're kind of in a pressure cooker of pandemic, quarantine life, socioeconomic mayhem, and increasing political division. And that, coupled with the death of George Floyd a few weeks ago and just the rise in public protesting has put us in a unique spot. So with that in mind, what should be the role of the church in addressing some of these things right now, addressing racial violence or racism?
You want to go ahead and start?
Sure. Yeah, I can start. I think, and we've talked about this on different occasions, but I believe it's layered. I think that the church actually should not be being reactive, but the church should already be standing in a place where we have a clear vision of what our view of justice is, and should be teaching and leaning into those things. But one of the things I think we run into an internal external kind of conflict where we want to make sure that we're exercising justice within the church before speaking to what's happening in the society. And so as we are, faithfully exercising justice within the church, we should be able to speak, I would say even prophetically to society, or even be a witness in how we conduct our lives as a church to the society. And it shouldn't be there shouldn't be any kind of hesitancy to be able to speak if we're conducting ourselves in a way that leans toward justice according to the Word of God.
Yeah, I like that picture.
Yeah, I think that idea of conduct, I think if the outside of the church, if they look in and see something that's attractive, then the words that we would connect to it would be hearable. But sort of the apprehension I feel in going out and preaching to the world about race is whatever side you're looking at on this conversation, they've done a very good job co-opting certain ideas and words and phrases that it gets very difficult to know, like, how can I enter that forum of conversation with devoid of sort of our witness of life together? How do I go over there with no credential and say something that is, if I say it that way, then it might be co-opted on one side. If I say it that way, it's being co-opted. And that feels a little bit like a lose-lose, or maybe another way I think about it is I think the prevailing culture in America is becoming less able to solve problems, not more able to solve problems. And so it really is the incarnated witness of the church that you almost have to convert somebody into, like, I want to know how they're doing it. And I mean, that I don't think either one of us are saying that as though we've done that, but as though it makes the commitment inside the church all the more important.
Yeah. Especially if you have people on the outside not able to solve problems, but also not hungry for what a church might be exuding or bringing.
Sure, because there's plenty of good examples of bad examples.
Yeah.
So they have plenty of reasons why they're not interested.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit more about justice later. So speaking about the world and what we're hearing, this phrase, systemic racism, is circulating a lot on news and media outlets. Would you help define or unpack what systemic racism is for our people, and maybe how we can unknowingly be a part of it, or systemic oppression in general?
Yeah, so I'd like you to respond to that question, but I just want to preface it because Pastor Dwayne and I have visited along the way on these issues at various levels, and this is when we get to this place, I find it is the place that I need to do the most listening, but I also find it is the place that he needs to go slowest for me. Like, in multiple times we've come here, I have, and I'm just trying to anticipate members in our church watching, if this is said correctly but too quickly, it will be well defended, defended against. And so even in this way of just getting a taste of it, I'm just going to say, if you're like me, be open to say probably the most learning comes here, and then if you're like Pastor Dwayne, go slow. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and we probably should have, at the onset, opened up with, we do not claim expertise
Oh, no.
in all of these things. I'm sure there are people that would tweak or maybe not be 100% in line with my view on systemic racism or oppression. But if you break it apart, we see racism as the assumptions of a people about another people. So in those assumptions create stories that people conduct themselves by. When those stories are that this other people are first other, and then not only other, but lesser, not as smart, not as talented, not as important, whatever that is, and that group that is naming the other group has the power to reinforce those stories. That's where I believe that's where racism finds its root or its strength, right? Then that group that is making that defining statement, when they have the power to organize the structures that surround both themselves and the other group, they can organize those structures in a way that it reinforces their view of that other group. It kind of not maybe self-fulfilling prophecy. It makes it be so, right? And so it becomes systemic when the group that has defined the other group so with their story of less in some way embeds that definition or that that thought, that story into the systems they create, whether it be education or criminal justice or whatever the system may be.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my nutshell answer.
That's a great
Can you
nutshell.
give a couple? Let's just
Yeah,
base
slow
level
down.
examples. No, base level examples. Because I'm thinking someone's listening, going, "But I don't see these systems.
Right.
Like I work hard, I pay my taxes." They might even say, "My grandfather came over on a boat, didn't speak a lick of English, with $2 in his pocket, and we picked ourselves up by our boots." So, in those senses, help us out.
Sure. Let's think of things. Well, we can begin if we're talking about our country, right? So we're talking about our country. We're talking about America. We can go back to the root of a system like slavery, right? You go back to the root of that system that legally, even constitutionally, set individuals of African descent that were kidnapped, brought here as less than human, right? you can fast forward until the Civil War, right? And then you have Civil War, and now those things are deemed illegal. Once that happens, people who held those beliefs, if they still maintain some power, okay, so now they can't do what they were doing, but because they still maintain power, they can do other things. And so now, okay, when it's time, so let's fast forward, say now it's time to vote. And they say, well, we know that it had been illegal for people, for Africans and African Americans in this country to learn to read. It was against the law to read and write for them, right? And so now, when it's time to vote and have an election, we're going to make a law, and we may even we'll let them vote, but in order for anybody to vote, they need to know how to read and write, right? Yeah. And so then that's a system, that's working in favor of someone and against someone else. And I mean, it's a real example, right? Yeah. But people, those things can be traced and tracked into other systems, such as maybe educational systems or again, criminal justice systems. The criminal justice system itself made provision to maintain a form of slave labor because of when the 13th Amendment was produced. It made an exception for anyone who was imprisoned. So if a person now is imprisoned, that person can be made to do the same things that they were made to do when they were enslaved. So that's another example of a system.
So I want to, and I'm trying to anticipate some of the calculus. Mm-hmm. So you might say to yourself, well, yeah, but the Civil Rights Act, that dealt with all of that. But we got so many things. We even have affirmative action. And in fact, someone might say what I experience in the workplace is reverse racism. And there's probably, there's truth in that. But I want to offer some subtle things. So if you may not see it acutely, I just want to share ways that I've seen it, and as sort of my eyes have I've become awake on this, or coming awake on this. So about 8 years ago, there was a homeless gentleman, and not that it matters, but he was white, but I was working with him to help get him a job. He was coming to our church, came to our church for about a year. And he turned out he ended up having a fairly significant alcohol problem. But that was being hidden. But in the process of trying to get him into an apartment and get him a job, it became clear he had a pretty significant criminal record. There was a warrant for his arrest in Maryland for possession. There was a couple of these DUIs, this sort of thing. And so turned out that I could get all of it expunged, meaning wiped off his record for fees, significant fees. And that was the first time I ever realized this. I realized that actually this is a classic example of a two-tier justice system of if you pay, you can operate, you can continue to fill out a resume. If you have a certain amount of family wealth, let's say, that exists, you can remain above you can make the same mistakes but avoid the consequences. And then if I fast forward, about 3 years ago, I was listening to NPR, and they were dealing with may not have been NPR, but they were dealing with the heroin crisis. And a woman called in from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which it's well-to-do. And she called into the radio station to complain about the word druggie, because she lived in Doylestown, Bucks County, and her son was a heroin addict, and she did not like her son being referred to as a druggie. And the first moment I heard that, I like was hit by the duplicity of her comment. Like the word was fine until it was her son, her Bucks County son. So it immediately became judgmental about her. And then I thought, the word has never been fine. You know, actually, she's becoming sensitive in a way that I should become sensitive. So there are these subtle things that that I'm finding, slowly by slowly, I'm seeing. And so you can't just look and go, Civil Rights Act, you know, these things just don't go away immediately.
Yeah. I think with any kind of system, there's different degrees of participation. You can be overtly participatory in evil, and you can be just kind of like dragged along. I'm just following orders, like when the Nazis were at their height and they were running a system of genocide of a certain target group of people, and the officers at the very top who were saying, let's do this, get rid of those people, they were overtly participating in the system. And then you had the guards who were following orders, but still participating whether or not they agreed. And then you had the people in the village who went along with the propaganda, not because they necessarily believed it, or maybe they did, but they didn't want to do anything about it. And then the people at the very bottom who still had to pay taxes no matter what. So I think there's just different levels of participation any way you look at it. And what feels most insidious is when we are unknowing participants of systemic evil, but don't really care, or care to know that we're a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in the United States, we pride ourselves in being individualistic thinkers and self-thinkers. It's part of being in America, you know? But how does individualism impact the way we think about systems, and especially when they're evil systems?
Well, I will say, to the degree that I reflect white culture, and certainly reflect the community in which I minister, the way individualism expresses itself is you honor success and you judge failure. So, you know, me and many of the members of our church live in neighborhoods where you enjoy being the person to offer your lawnmower, but you do not want to be the person who needs to borrow a lawnmower. So there's a sense of I do enjoy the feeling of virtue that comes from my successful position. But there is also a great shame in needing help. And I think that's an enemy to community. And I think that's a sort of an enemy to the sort of the confessional interdependence that you'd find that we find expressed in Scripture, of bearing one another's burdens. So, and throughout this whole conversation, the truth is, to the degree that we say anything true about race, we're finding ourselves somewhere pretty close to the gospel of the refusal to see someone as equal before the Lord, and I think this idea of I'm autonomous, and if I feel that way, then I look over at someone who's in one of these lesser categories, and I think had he had his stuff together, he really wouldn't be there. Like, we judge failure that way. Because if I did it individually, whether or not I actually did, okay? But I remember this when President Obama said, there was a phrase that became, in the conservative world, it was like a four-letter phrase. He said, "You didn't build that." And he was speaking to the notion of like taxation, and man, that was just like a dog whistle for the highly individualistic civil liberties right. That, and I think he was trying to say something. He may have overspoke, but I thought that there was this wow. look how we feel about this. So.
Yeah. Do you have any comments?
Oh, my comments actually went to it seemed like they took another avenue. So I don't know if they really. I was thinking of how individualism can, how it feeds some of the thoughts of elitism, and how it also it looks at, if we take this back to race, it looks to individuals who have done something exceptional, and then but it doesn't recognize that they shouldn't be exceptional. There's a reason why an individual from a group has now become exceptional, right? Because as a rule, the group is not, having that type of success, or having that type of, attaining to that level that is deemed, exceptional. And so that it's an individualistic, and then it's looked at as a reference to the entire group, I guess, and as a point of reference or convenience to explain or not, or deny, or that a thing exists. But so that's the perspective I was thinking of. So it's a little different.
Yeah. No, I get that.
Did we get at what you were asking, Grace?
Yeah, I think what I'm hoping to help us see is that thinking of ourselves as individuals who are products of our own choices that reflect ourselves is not gospel thinking, because we are all products of our communities as well, and so our choices reflect the communities that we're from, and in that way, what we choose to say and do and believe should honor the communities that we're part of. And in that sense, we take ownership of when our body hurts, right? So when our community hurts, we hurt, and we feel responsible to make it right.
So the Gospel of Romans, I'm going to say it this way, Paul starts by judging the outside world, and you can almost imagine the Jewish audience in the church being like, right on, preach it. They're passionate and sinful, and they're malicious. And then he turns to the Jews that are listening and says, like, how much more significant is you do the same things that they do, and you claim to be a light to the blind, a guide to the blind, a light to the world. You enjoy this position of we might just say religious privilege, moral privilege before the Lord, and yet your life doesn't reflect. I think what would be true before Christ is any privilege we have before Christ is leveraged for Christ, on behalf of others, right? So there's this laying down and this offering up, that again we see as this is not peripheral gospel. This is red meat gospel. This is the center of the gospel. Is those who had much gave, so that those who had need had enough. And so there's a sense of should not be a defensiveness around the ideas of because individual and personal privilege are they hold hands, right? And there shouldn't be this defensiveness in the real Christian heart. To the degree that we're defensive, it's anti-Christian.
Right.
Because what do you have that you have not received? And what part of your life is not purposed for Christ? So just that basic logic starts to call into question the nature of our heart.
Yeah, thank you. We're spending a lot of time on this section on racism in the church. Um, well, I wanted to ask this one question. Not everyone's familiar with our church and denomination history, but the Southern Baptist Convention, right, was founded after a not amicable split with Northern Baptists over the issue of slavery and abolition and black civil rights. While this is not our current reality, it's something that we have inherited as part of the SBC. So I'm wondering how we reconcile our denominational, even national history with this very present need for justice now. Like, how do we hold both of those things? Don't know if you've thoughts.
Well, you haven't been Southern Baptist that long, right? You have less to answer for.
Yeah, exactly. I will say this. I have a mindset that is incarnational, and that you can redeem things from within better or more readily than you can redeem things from without. And so, I may not hesitate to go into spaces that have been traditionally something else, and to go in those spaces and still be, authentically who I am, and express in those spaces, things that are necessary through my lens, So.
Yeah. I think, we want to be people of mercy and grace.
Yeah.
So if we write off entities because of their past, like that, once again, that starts to find its way back to us. However, I would say one way that this enters our thinking is what are they doing now? What is the Southern Baptist Convention doing now? That, in other words, how do we measure who they are? Like even you would say this in a marriage. You want to forgive a past, but you're interested in a present. And I'd say on this, I see things I like and I see things I don't like. So I see a genuine effort to elevate, African American Southern Baptists into places of notoriety. So the Baptist Convention of Maryland and Delaware, which is a highly, highly diverse state convention that we're part of. So there are more people groups in the Baptist Convention of Maryland and Delaware than any other convention in the country.
Wow, I found out that.
Mostly because of Silver Springs, Maryland area. So we have hundreds and hundreds of people groups. And Dr. Smith is an African American, and I think there's a good-hearted intentionality there. I will say, and I think Pastor Dwayne and I share this, I regret the degree to which the southernness of the Southern Baptist Convention remains politically entangled. Yeah. And this subject of race, maybe this even segues you out of the church, but the subject of race and politics are almost inextricable. Yeah. And so I feel like the work that we're trying to do up here, which, you don't play politics. Is so unproductive. It is so unproductive in gospel work in this area to kind of lead with that. Yeah. We find a large part of our denomination is still leaning on that. And I'd say that's been a frustration for us both.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've talked about systems, we've talked about denominational history. At the individual level, for the Jesus-loving person, how do you go about recognizing if you have racist thoughts or beliefs in your heart? Considering that no one likes to be called a racist or think of themselves that way.
I'll be quiet until you talk.
Yeah. Some of it, some of it is monitoring your reactions to these questions or these type of things.
Wow.
Your reaction to these type of things can give you insight to your heart. Why is this necessary? I think about my daughter and her school. She was in a Christian school, high school, and she started a thing called the Multicultural Alliance. And some people wanted to know why it was necessary. When you start to have questions, and those questions don't come to or lead to some kind of healthy resolution or lead to a place that of wanting to actually learn, wanting to actually get understanding, then you can actually start to recognize that there may be some things going on in your heart that aren't in line maybe with the gospel. And so another important thing is you said how do you recognize?
Yeah, how do you know?
Yeah, I think another important thing is the Jesus strategy is that it's you set your table and you set individuals around your table who don't look like you, right? And as you begin to have these interactions at your table, you begin to hear things, you begin to see things, and if it's a table of love, it's a Christian table, then there's room for dialogue, then there's room for maybe peeling back, and dialogue on both sides. The people at the table also have to have a spirit of grace that can allow someone to ask a question, and maybe not be offended, or be offended and not run off, and so the table is an important thing. Having, and I'm metaphorically and literally, having the other someone other than yourself, not a mirror, at your table. Those are ways I think that it starts to surface. Things can start to surface.
Yeah.
So just to highlight, if you are strongly individualistic, the table is not important. And I don't think Facebook counts as a table.
Oof.
So, this, yeah.
Or Twitter.
Or any social media platform for that matter.
That's right. You are not fellowshipping with Tucker Carlson. As you watch the news, these sorts of things. That's not fellowship.
Yeah. I like what you said about gauging your reaction, because when we have emotional reactions that
visceral,
that are gut reactions, and we don't take time to feel what we're feeling and then act on the facts, then it becomes this reactive chain of I'm so offended, and not conducive to loving your neighbor more.
Or why I'm feeling it.
Yeah.
Why am I feeling? Why does that make me feel this way? Why does someone saying Black Lives Matter make me feel this way? And Pastor John and I were talking about that earlier. The distinctions between the entity and the expression, the humanity of the expression versus an entity of people. But yeah. So.
Well, and part of this, kind of just to follow, is we're a very polarized culture.
Yeah.
So when we garner things that we call information, first of all, most of the information we garner is not important. It's fundamentally doesn't really shape our life. But we're calling things essential that are not important, and we're oftentimes underlooking important information, like people around us. But still, when we tap into our news feeds, what has happened, and I have encountered this again and again and again, is I am building a set of beliefs based upon something that I'm calling truth.
Yeah.
And there might be somebody that is very much that I have nearly everything in common with, particularly Christ. But they're building their view of reality on a different set of information that they're calling truth. And so we're finding ourselves heading away from each other on topics. Every day we're farther away on topics, even though I really think if we were concerning ourselves with information that matters, like Wilmington, not the world, but like the church, like the members of our church, like our neighbors, then I actually think we'd be operating in a less polarized environment, and we'd find that we were not that different. But so, Black Lives Matter as a movement, if you go to the news sites that I go to, Black Lives Matter is a socialist, Marxist co-opting. It's been co-opted. It's seeking to overturn the capitalism. Okay, and there are legitimate data points. Okay, so this isn't just a smokescreen. There's good people. You're watching YouTubes of people saying down with capitalism, and you're like, what? However, if you're on the other side, you're watching other news, you're seeing Black Lives Matter is simply trying to champion the notion of there's a community that's hurting. Do they matter or don't they? And so then this group is feeling one way and this group's feeling another, and it has so much to do with what we're calling truth. And I don't find any way to get around that apart from choosing to focus on what are really the more important questions.
Yeah.
And again, back to the table.
Yeah.
If there's someone sitting at your table weeping,
There's
a heart issue if that doesn't matter to you, right? So the closer you draw in, I think the more you can hear, the more you can see. Gives you the opportunity to listen and allow Christ to guide you.
I'd like to stay on this table thing for a little while, just because I've had several experiences as a person of color at church, and I'm deeply curious to know the how. How can we get past the polarization? How can we get into the meal, the actual communion that takes place over the table? So as someone who's had to navigate like the tricky waters of being hurt in a racial way, almost always unintentionally, by an offhand comment or an assumption that's made, or someone confusing me for someone else, or thinking that I related to someone else. In church, almost always innocent, but hurtful anyway. It can be really hard to feel like I constantly carry the burden of being the one to educate others or adjust my internal expectations or edit myself to exist in church. And so I'm wondering, what do we do with that, built up feeling in church, and how do we get past that polarization? Like, where is this table? How do I get to the table, especially in COVID times? And
Well, I think for one is if it's unintentional and unconscious, then there will be no learning unless it's brought to light. And with anyone, so this happens on race, but this happens at every level of life. So this is that environment where, the less and less we know one another and live life together, and I feel like the vision of the church is about to come out. So the less devoted we are to the fellowship, the less we will break bread together. This is the passage, right? They've devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, the breaking of bread and prayer. And I think there's a sequence. The more convicted I am about the gospel and the truths of Christ, what he's done for me, the more I will devote my life to the people around me, because I've been made for a purpose and called. Yeah. And the more I do that, then I will end up at a table with them. And then I will pray for them and myself. And that is, we simply cannot have the things we want without giving ourselves over. And this is true with, all of us bite our tongues, and all of us, kind of do that. And I recognize that on issues of race, I don't do that on an issue of race. Right? That's not where I do it. And I do appreciate, I have a growing appreciation, at least, that people of color who are going to a majority white church, and I think there should be a sense that they're doing more work on Sunday. They cross the bridge. But I think that there is a need that on occasion you kind of have to ask that, is this the time? Is this the example? Is this the learning moment? Is this the person that I have enough of a friendship with that it actually brings me closer to the table rather than farther from the table? And I think those are questions of wisdom. But
yeah, I was just juggling some of that I was hearing. There is wisdom in the response, but I think there needs to be a response to the degree that you walk away with a wound. There needs to be a response. If we're talking about something that's rolling off your shoulder, that's one thing. But to the degree that there's now a wound and this thing is I'm carrying it, there needs to be a response. We should be, the Bible calls us to seek, reconciliation, because a wound will separate you, and so we don't want to be found erring in that way, as the Bible tells us how, when you're looking at someone else's sin, that be careful that you don't end up being pulled into, a sin. So we do want to be seeking reconciliation, and then I think knowing, I think asking for the communication, requesting, say, I need to tell you, there's something I need to tell you, and someone at the church, someone who's claiming, faith in Christ, they should have a willingness, and then there's still, elders and pastors that can be involved with those things. I think, if they can't be navigated, clearly, if it's, more than just a slight or, something like that. But I think it, it bears, making a statement, let's talk a little more, about that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering which way to go from here. I could spend some time talking about Acts 6, when the apostles hear this complaint from the Greek Jews that their widows are being neglected in the daily distribution of food, and the individual problem, right, the hurt becomes a systemic thing. Mm-hmm. And they act swiftly to give the Greek Jews voice and representation in leadership. So they kind of solve the problem in a very quick manner. And I'm just wondering, you're right, when there is unconscious hurt, or lack of education that is kind of causing someone to have pain, there is an opportunity that you have to weigh with wisdom whether or not you address it with someone. But say this has been going on a long time, and people of color don't even know how to talk about it. At that point, would there be representation to help us out, or what's the avenue to take?
I mean, if I was talking about the body there in the congregation in Wilmington, I would be prayerful that someone would bring that to me, and because I serve as the elder there, right, the pastor, but that someone would bring that someone would feel safe to bring that, to me if they felt like this is a climate, versus just something, one off, but that this is a climate, because I think a climate needs to be addressed in a different way than something else, but
than a moment,
right? Yeah. And so, but then again, I'm speaking as a person of color, as a black man, and so I would think someone experiencing that around me would come to me, So I let.
Yeah, but it sounded, what you said sounded. I think the recipe or the pattern is the same, is raceless, And what's interesting in Acts 6, it's the fellowship that selects those people, not the apostles. So it shows there was a conviction. The apostles say, choose from among yourselves. They don't do it. I think what you're pointing to when you describe that is it seems that the names that are all listed are Greek. So there's this evening out of, you have these Hebrew apostles and these Greek second leaders, so that the body is cared for. And I do think there is that of, as the church becomes aware, there should be, beyond the elders, there should be, to the degree that we're aware, a spirit of contrition on these things. And I'm trying to think of occasions where, this is one of these moments where I go, well, I don't know if that's ever happened, which might get to the difficulty in the fellowship of saying them. I can think of behind closed doors, some areas where people have gently come to me, but it's felt like that was the right place for it to come and stay.
Yeah. Thanks.
No. So I kind of, it seems like I'm hearing that, like, there needs to be, let me go secular, if there is such a thing, right? Let me go secular, that you're saying almost like if you're in a workplace, there's an HR person that you go to when things are happening. I'm kind of hearing
like an equal opportunity officer.
Yeah. I'm kind of hearing some of that, right?
Like, what's the mechanism?
Yeah. So
that's accurate.
Yeah. And so I put myself in the place of the mechanism, there. But I'm in a smaller setting. I'm in and it's easier to do, right? So I don't know if there needs to be a mechanism or
we're where the elders are the mechanism.
Yeah, but maybe this dialogue, the fact that this is on video now, it's known, or maybe it wasn't considered before, but it's known, saying this is a place where I can address that. It's safe for me to address these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think another concept using your table metaphor is hospitality. So being Asian, hospitality is a huge deal for us. And the whole entire point of being hospitable is how welcome and honored you make your guests feel. And when you set the table and you don't do it with that kind of hospitality in mind, you actually miss out on certain guests being at your table. So when I think about being in the minority at a majority white church, it's, for me, the hospitality and the witness go hand in hand. You know, doing things in a way that makes sure that you're welcoming all.
So
Yeah.
a majority white community is not that hospitable. Right?
Not to all. Maybe in a white way, yes.
Right. I mean, when I look at my experiences abroad on missions,
Yes.
right, when you start to enter into honor cultures and honor-shame cultures, or highly hospitable cultures, I go, this is not like home.
No.
And this connects to your concepts of individuality, right? Of the amount of anxiety someone feels by opening their home because of what people will think. They have to clean their home. We operate at I'm being assessed right now. And that spirit of assessment shuts us down. So it's valuable for us to realize how enmeshed and connected so many of these themes are.
Right. Yeah.
Because the more you do that, you realize the problem's big, not small. And there's some part of you in the spider web, right? That someone plucks this string on your spider web, and you are actually, someone else is seeing this as a racial idea. Way across the web, unbeknownst to you, it's being felt racially. Because, again, a majority culture doesn't think in terms of race because it's default. Yeah. And so, whereas a minority, when I am in Egypt, I am constantly aware that I'm not Egyptian.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that there is, just on that question of hospitality, that's probably, there's obviously places where our church could grow. Yeah. And there's better reasons to grow than simply solving a racial problem. There's really good, really central reasons.
Yeah. You kind of answered one of my next questions about how, why is racial identity so critical to how we do missions and witness, both globally and locally. And like you said, when you go to a different country with totally different social protocol, it absolutely matters understanding, customs, language, and your kind of position in that society to be able to receive and understand, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's the same locally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to comment on that?
Yeah. Well, it's the same. It's the same locally, meaning, even for example, here in the city, you can't just step out into the city and assume what you're doing is being received as a blessing.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about when we were in school, and we just studying missions. It's like one of the things is that when in moving into communities, there's a tendency to say, to think, I'm going to beautify this community, and I'm going to plant trees here, and the people in that community may not want trees, and so there's in any engagement, cross culture, there has to be the consideration of hearing, what is love to me, what is love to them, what does it look like, what does it sound like, not assuming that my love is what, and even Christ, demonstrated his love, and we know what he did ultimately, but he demonstrated his love in different ways, with the woman at the well, than he did with Zacchaeus,
He had an uncanny ability of knowing what people needed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So considering all of these topics that we're bringing up, these, dim sum portions of hospitality and racial identity and awareness, culture, what would you say is important for people at church to know about how you pursue this kind of work of love at Hockessin and Wilmington, respectively? And how does racial identity and awareness impact that?
Well, I'll start from the perspective of, is God a sending God or is he not? Because if he's a sending God, you operate very differently if you see yourself as sent somewhere. And this is the versus, is church the product you consume? That's probably the chief sin, the suburban sin of Christianity, which puts yourself at the center. And anytime you're at the center, you're trying to conform the world around you to make you feel a certain way. But if we see ourselves as sent, then we are asking questions like, how are they hearing it? What are their questions? How are they thinking? And again, I just think like the Great Commission has a voice in this a little bit of just at the ground floor. How do you view your role in the kingdom? And Paul says, I become all things to all people that I might win some. That is, I'm sent. I am sent to them. And I think the more we understood that, the more attractive we would appear to the world. So, that's where I would start.
Yeah, I think I would just say I mirror that. That is the starting point. That's the starting point. Who it is you represent and what you're called to do.
Yeah.
There was and growing up, there was some things that were just plain. If your mother sent you out to the store, from your house to your store, to pick up something from the store, you went out and you conducted yourself in a certain way. When you saw elders on the street, it was a miss or a mister. It was you were sent out, but you were sent out from somewhere, right? And you had a obligation, to conduct what there was consequences, right?
Oh, yes.
But you conducted yourself a certain way, even as a representative of the house you were sent out from, right? And so, like you said, we consider those things as we go out, and and even as we invite others in, as we, what are we inviting others into? You invite people into your home when it's a disaster. I'm not calling the church a disaster, but you prepare your home for people to come in, right? So.
Yeah. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. We started the conversation talking about justice a little bit, and I think we also covered that whatever is in our past, Jesus can redeem. It's still there. It's part of our story, but he redeems it, right? And I think anyone who's born in the United States, we inherit a racially violent history. It's not something we can ignore or say it didn't happen. It's just something that we inherit when we're born American. But when we choose to follow Jesus, he rewrites that story, right, with his blood and his sacrifice. And it doesn't just stop there, because he invites us into kingdom work of making right, our relationship with him and with others, with the earth, So I'm curious, what is your vision for justice work for the church? How does the church go and do justice on those levels?
So I'm curious if we're going to end up on different sides of the same coin. I'll be interested. But it makes me want you to go first. Not that I'm like keeping powder dry or anything, but I want to hear what you think.
Yeah. I think there's multiple. Well, one, anything concerning the church begins with Christ, right? Mm-hmm. What is Christ's example, of justice in his interactions with others, right? And so once we start there, one, we make sure that it is evident among us, right? And then as we go out, because when I talk about the table, it's not just it's not really just us at the table. Christ said, "Go out." In Luke, mm-hmm. he said, don't just invite your friends, that can pay you back. He said, go out to the poor and the lame. So he wants us to look to those who aren't traditionally invited to the table, right? And so that I think that is that's kind of a launching point. Are you not only seeing those that are not, typically invited, typically having a seat at the table, right? Are you seeing those? Are you desiring them to have the fellowship of Christ at that table? Are you desiring them to even have the dignity of the Imago Dei, right? Are you desiring that? And so then as you go out, so you're going to desire that, to have those people at your table. And so now you have to go out, you have to hear them, you have to walk with them. And I think you pour into their lives, not just you pour into their lives the gospel, but you also pour into their lives kind of a sympathy that walks along with them in those conditions that they like I said, that Christ listed when he was talking about the table. And that table ultimately is going to be that banquet, the great banquet with him, but that's a launching point. I think the mindset of seeking others, mm-hmm. is what starts you in the path of justice, because you find, when you find others in places that are unjust, or if you're there for them, you're on purpose, right? So now it leaves you in a place where how do I correct this, or how do I come alongside of this? What do I do? It doesn't let you just walk by.
Right.
So that's a beginning. That's a beginning.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're kind of saying, at the heart of justice work is really the relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where I start with that, I feel very close to the smallness of the way that I heard you describe it, which mm-hmm. was very up close and personal. Mm-hmm. And in other words, I feel like justice is found not in grand global movements, but almost as I come across them. Now, this is where I'm probably would be classified as like a social pessimist. I do not think, and even the way you described it initially, I almost want to correct it a little bit. It's not that the United States has a sort of violent racial history that's all that unique. Mankind has a violent racial history.
Right.
So you go anywhere on this planet, and I mean, I was in seminary classes with Korean students and Japanese students, and you knew it. And you talk to Frenchmen about Germans, and you'll know it. You talk to English about Irish, and you know it. I mean, everywhere you go, everywhere, it's been around since Act 6, since Adam, right? So in that sense, I do think America hurts itself in the way that it almost arrogantly obsesses as though it's cornered the market on this, or that the roots of it are found in our history. Mm-hmm. This is not a racial thing. It's an ethnocentric perspective of racism that then postures us to try to fix it in an artificially simple way. It will never be fixed. This is where someone might find me overly pessimistic. It will never be fixed until Christ victoriously rides in. He alone will fix it. And I'm talking at these broad global levels. The people in power will always seek to maintain power by whatever means they can, with whatever community they identify themselves with. Mm-hmm. And that will very often, in the way we think, feel racial. And so I am broadly pessimistic. And that's where I would even go back to earlier. I think outside the community, the true church of Jesus Christ, American culture is day by day becoming less able, not more able, to heal itself. And so, again, that pessimism, it might be wrong, but that sort of shapes how I think. And it drives me locally. It drives me to, I spend hours and hours, like I'm sure Pastor Dwayne does, thinking about my fellowship, my neighbors, better my neighbors these years than prior, but the little world around me that I actually touch and that I actually have so much in common with and that I actually can change. And I find the scriptures sound more like that mm-hmm. than they do like the former picture of historically altering movements versus tiny village movements that alter history as a byproduct. And so that's where I feel like outside the churches, I'm almost in a lose-lose because the world is saying, fix it. But I actually think we're losing some of the basic tools, like civility. So this is where they almost need to feel called into what we're doing, which then says to us, what are we doing?
Yeah.
And on, I guess, not on that coin, but in terms of, we were looking at the small picture. In terms of, the broader picture, I think we still have decisions to make with the small picture in mind, right? And so we still inevitably have choices and have we're held accountable for our influence, how we speak, when we choose to speak, when we don't choose to speak. So there is a time and a place, I think, where where bigger pictures need to be assessed and kind of spoken to, and spoken to from a righteous perspective. I mean, because, and I don't want to get us off into a tangent, because there are broad, nationwide issues. I can think of one in particular that the church always speaks into, right? And so we can't necessarily pick and choose. I don't think that we can necessarily pick and choose the if something is an identifiable sin, to choose to say we'll be silent on this, but we'll speak on that. If that makes sense, what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So those, in other words, I'm saying those smaller movements, our immediate context, I don't think it exempts us from our voice necessarily in a, and when I say our voice, I mean like our prophetic voice in a broader scheme of things.
Which is hard because nobody liked the prophets in
Correct.
the Bible. And it's really unpopular to be that one voice or church that says, actually, we're not about this. And I don't know how you pray or discern those things as pastors, but I do agree that with the small movements, there are moments when the church's voice is desperately needed on bigger issues.
I think God stirs the hearts of individuals on that too.
Yeah.
So there's I'd be cautious to try to say everybody needs to speak equally on every subject.
Right.
I would say it's not helpful and it's not healthy when we look to the black church to speak on racism. And you guys got it, and we kind of have this nascent agreement with you, but you don't need our role in it, or so it's. But there's that balance of is God calling me? Because just to share, like for a pastor's heart. If you started to try to carry the torch on every issue, you should resign tomorrow. It's beleaguering and it's suffocating, and so there's got to be to say we have to speak. There's got to be something else in there to start to filter. Well, so for me, for some reason, I regularly found myself I've driven to Dover, to Legislative Hall, probably 4 times to speak before the House. But it was almost always about gambling, the expansion of gambling in the state, which I thought was a system of oppression. The fact that they were trying to open a casino in an already impoverished community, I thought that was unwise. I don't know why that caught me, but I was energized by that, and I felt like a lonely voice, with my 3 minutes being shooed out of the room. And of no avail. I think sometimes the prophets are simply getting God on tape as having spoken. But I don't know why it was that and not other things. Yeah. And so there's that balance of sometimes the willingness, yes, the obligation on everything, that's a hard one to balance.
Yeah. And I would say it takes practice to recognize the voice of the Spirit that compels you to speak prophetically.
Yeah, I suppose if we never did it, we should suspect something. Yeah. But even then, I'd say different pastors, I'd like to know what you think, but different pastors have different gifts in these areas. Mm-hmm. And I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. Well, I'll loop us back. Earlier, you had mentioned, Pastor Dwayne, about what happens when we're reactive as opposed to a little bit more wise in our responses to racism or something hurtful. And I'm curious, what are ways that in our smaller movements or village networks, we call it village mapping in university language, but what are some ways that we as a church can be proactive against the sin of racism and proactive for change and justice? Keeping in mind that we live in shelter-in-place, COVID social distancing times where, like, what is community anymore? Yeah.
I guess it's difficult to pinpoint when you put it within those restraints, of COVID.
Well, that was optional.
Yeah.
Thought it would be applicable.
Right. Again, I just think the most proactive thing is to have a community where different voices are heard and different voices are heard equally. When you have that, then you have a perspective that's broader, and so I think that's proactive against some of the ills that could even creep into the church, right? So having those voices, making room and space for those voices that are not the same voices as your voice, I think that's a critical proactive step. Yeah.
I find even as you share, I feel that you're part of that story, for our church, and I've been very grateful for that. This idea of proactive is so true. If they're already at the table, then there's this spirit of we're in this together.
Yeah.
And so these are moments for our country. I just want to think of many good churches, many good fellowships all across the country, that they are kind of struck with conviction, but they don't have someone else at the table. And that doesn't solve it, but I just think there's a way that you felt sent to us, and the way that we felt sent into Wilmington 10 years ago, and those things matter. They don't. You don't know why, but then there's a day that it matters, and so I feel like I see what you've said, kind of working out in our story. I'm grateful for that.
Yeah. And I think one additional thing is if another proactive thing is that you take time to educate yourself on other positions, right? So there's some work to be done. So if you know that these things exist, there disparities, there are and you don't necessarily even have a multitude of those voices around you to hear from. Those voices are there in literature. They're there in writing. Some of those voices are there in film and documentary. Taking time, even as a I'll speak outside, inside, as a majority culture, taking time to do some work in that area, saying, well, let me hear some other things. Let me hear his perspective. Let me read what this is, and it's more than just somebody shouting in a moment. Like, well, this is this book has a history of 75 years of examples and descriptions and stories. So being willing to do the work, if you know that these things exist, taking the time to say, this is worth me doing, this is worth me doing. I think that's proactive,
It's honoring.
Yeah.
It is honoring.
Yeah.
Earlier you said we're losing our civility as we get more and more polarized. And I think one of the most proactive questions that you can ask someone who's different than you is, hey, what are you thinking and feeling about X, Y, and Z? I'd love to know your thoughts. And yeah, not taking it to like a Facebook or a platform where you're just that voice shouting and dumping information, but doing the small village relating work in that way.
And that can be done in COVID. You can Zoom that.
Yes.
No, you can
or text you can that.
Don't text it. Don't text it. text get misconstrued. That's me. That's just
yeah.
me.
I'm a different generation, I guess.
Yeah, we're not nuanced texters. So.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. Well, we're going to wrap up our time here, but I'd love to know, as a final question, what's one thing you would love to see God do or grow in our congregation, in our midst, as a result of this dialogue?
Well, I mean, I have some selfish desires. So, I kind of hope that, the distance down the road, whatever that is, over the hill, I think in terms of friendship. So I think of Pastor Dwayne and Pastor Terry as my friends. And so I have those selfish, or not selfish, but very close up feelings like, will I serve well alongside of them in this over time? Will I pass their test? So, and I think for me, and I'm thinking of this in terms of Hockessin. Okay. So I know I have a kind of a shepherding role at the church, but a lot of my pastoring is in Hockessin. I'm trying to commit to not leaving this subject in a moment, but trying to add a question in my head, even as I study the Word, as I go through. So not wait till Black History Month to say something, right? I don't like to use the newspaper for Sunday. And partly it's because, there's things all around the world that are happening. And so then when you sound like you're picking and choosing, but at the same time, I feel like there's a weakness and almost there needs to be a letting in of what's happening in our lives. That's, I feel like as a pastor, maybe it's the best things you can do is model a habitual behavior. Rather than sort of an eloquent monologue. So I think that's where I rejoice when I see people not like me in roles of leadership and creativity in our church. So those are just places of joy, but I don't know if I don't have the wand to make that happen. I don't have the wand to wave where 10 more African Americans used to come to Hockessin, which would be great. But if I had that wand, I'd be a really wealthy person. So some things you just don't control.
Yeah, I would. Part of my hope would be that the church would see a willingness and openness to have dialogue, to share injuries or curiosities or whatever it may be, that the church would now feel that we are developing safe places to have dialogue, and we're here and everybody's still alive and nobody's bleeding, right? And so we're developing those spaces and that kind of a culture where we can have dialogue like this, and with the eye to becoming those that will walk worthy according to the calling that we're called with the eye to be witnesses and light to the community, to the world around us. Not just dialogue for dialogue's sake. A lot of organizations are having, specifically minorities or black people say, oh, tell us a story about your experience, and they did it at, gotta watch what I say. Somebody I know, they were doing it at their job, and I said, what's the end? To what end? That the people at your job heard your story, or is it the end that there will start to be some changes, as a result of it, and so that there could be change and just consideration toward what it looks like to be at this table, and at the table with those that aren't like you, and to be honoring to those, and there at the table, and then outside of the walls.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I think personally, for me, I want to grow in my vision. Like, I want to be able to see those who aren't like me hurting more clearly than I have been before. And I want a bigger table, where we're having the problem of, there aren't enough seats, let's make more. I think that'd be a great problem to have. I'll end with this quote by Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil. She says, our theology informs our anthropology, which in turn informs our sociology. That is to say, what we believe about God will tell us what we believe about people, and what we believe about people will tell us what kinds of communities and societies we believe we should strive to create. So I hope that by watching and tuning in, that everyone is able to have a moment of, wow, what has this been like for me to listen, and to kind of reflect back to God, maybe some of the work that he would like to do. Yeah.
Thanks, Grace.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Good.